Get out! You don't belong here! The shout tore through the classroom like glass shattering on marble. For a moment, the room froze. The polished desks, the spotless uniforms, the neat Nike sneakers all seemed to lean forward, drawn into the vortex of humiliation. 10-year-old Elena Alvarez, daughter of a janitor, stood stiff in the eye of that storm. Her notebook, a battered thing, its spine cracked from years of reuse, hung limp in her trembling hands. Inside, the pages bore equations scrawled in her small, precise handwriting. Now, one of those pages lay crumpled at her feet, dismissed as garbage by the very person meant to nurture her mind. Eleanor Henderson, veteran teacher of University of Chicago Elementary, had delivered the verdict with the finality of a judge slamming down the gavel. Her voice carried authority, tinged with disdain. "You are nothing but a charity case," she added coldly, as if each word could drive Elena further into the shadows. The classroom held its breath. A few students shifted uneasily, their polished shoes squeaking faintly against the waxed floor. Others looked at Elena with a mixture of pity and superiority. To them, she was the anomaly. A child in a frayed sweater, wrists patched with coarse thread, intruding upon their world of comfort and inherited opportunity. Elena bent slowly to retrieve the paper. Her fingers shook, but her gaze never left the blackboard. There, chalk dust framed a half-finished equation, symbols that seemed to float between two worlds, the world of order and the world of possibility. To most in the room, it was nothing but an exercise in algebra, perhaps a stepping stone toward calculus. To Elena, it was a door. She could feel the solution burning inside her like a secret fire. Not one solution, but three, each unraveling with a clarity that made her heart race. And yet, clarity was powerless here. In this room, it was not truth that mattered, but pedigree. Not precision, but addresses written on admissions forms. Not brilliance, but the weight of last names carved into university walls. A janitor's daughter had no currency in such a market. A ray of autumn sunlight filtered through the tall windows, striking the motes of chalk dust that floated down over her black hair. They fell like ashes, as if from some quiet funeral, ashes of a dream already deemed impossible. But beneath the humiliation, something stirred. Elena's chest ached as though it would split in two, one half urging her to flee, to vanish before more laughter came, the other screaming to stand her ground, to carve her presence into the blackboard itself. In the silence that followed, she made a promise that only her heart could hear. One day, they will see me. One day, the world will have no choice but to see. The morning dragged on, each tick of the classroom clock punctuating her exile. Henderson called upon children whose parents donated to the school fund, their answers rehearsed, their mistakes forgiven. Elena sat invisible, though inside her mind the chalkboard equations multiplied into visions, currents of air swirling like turbulent eddies, gears meshing in silent precision, numbers dancing into harmonies. To Elena, mathematics was not lines of chalk. It was a living thing. She had once overheard a graduate student in the janitor's lounge mention the Navier-Stokes equations, muttering about turbulence in fluid dynamics. Though she could not yet grasp the symbols, she sensed in them the same restless beauty she saw when oil swirled in puddles at the garage where she sometimes lingered. The world, she knew, moved by hidden laws, and she longed to touch them. Yet in Henderson's class, longing was an offense. At lunch, Elena sat alone at the edge of the cafeteria. The laughter of children at long tables rolled over her like waves, but none of them came close. She unwrapped a sandwich her grandmother had packed. 2 thin slices of bread, a smear of beans. It filled the belly, but not the silence. Her grandmother, Rosa Alvarez, was the pillar who held their fragile home together. A woman with knuckles worn from scrubbing, she had raised Elena since her father's sudden death. Rosa worked wherever hands were needed: laundry, kitchens, odd repairs, anything to keep Elena clothed and in school. She often told the child, "Knowledge is a weapon no one can steal, mija. Keep sharpening it." Elena clung to those words now, as if they were armor. When classes ended, Elena waited until the hallway emptied. She avoided the main gate, slipping instead through a side exit. Her path wound through the streets of Hyde Park, past the bookstores and coffee shops that spilled light and laughter onto 53rd Street. She walked quickly, head down, as if carrying a secret too heavy for strangers' eyes. At the corner stood a garage, its sign faded, its windows streaked with grease. To others, it was a relic of an older neighborhood. To Elena, it was a sanctuary. The smell of oil and iron, the clang of tools, the low hum of engines. It was here, in this cathedral of machines, that she found freedom. Inside, Joseph Washington, once a renowned mechanic, now silver-haired and thick-fingered, looked up from beneath the hood of a rusted Buick. His face broke into a smile. "Little engineer," he greeted, wiping his hands on a rag. "You made it." The nickname always lit something inside Elena. Here, she was not charity case. She was not out of place. She was engineer, apprentice, dreamer. Joseph rummaged in a corner and produced a set of overalls far too large for her small frame. She slipped them on, the sleeves rolled up, the legs dragging, but to her it felt like donning armor. Joseph watched her with quiet amusement. "One day," he said, "these machines will answer to you." Elena smiled faintly, her eyes drifting to the disassembled gears on the workbench. She traced their teeth with a fingertip, already seeing not just the part but the whole, the way torque transferred, the way motion whispered through steel. The garage door rattled as the wind picked up outside. Beyond those thin walls, the world still believed she did not belong. But in here, among oil-stained floors and scattered tools, Elena was certain of one truth. She was not broken, not invisible, not voiceless. She was becoming. The night deepened, and Elena returned home to the small apartment she shared with her grandmother. Rosa sat in her chair mending clothes under a single bulb. Her face softened when she saw Elena, though she caught the shadow in the child's eyes. "They don't see you yet," Rosa murmured, "but you carry something brighter than their lights. Keep it safe, until the day comes to show it." Elena curled against her grandmother's side, the hum of the city outside their window like a distant tide. She thought of the promise she had made in the classroom. She thought of the equation unfinished on the blackboard and how easily the solution had unfolded in her mind. She thought of the dust falling on her hair and how it had felt like ash, and she whispered, barely audible even to herself, "One day, I will turn the ash into fire." The final bell rang at University of Chicago Elementary, yet Elena did not move with the tide of students pouring toward the front gate. Their laughter carried privilege, voices that knew the comfort of chauffeured cars and waiting parents. Elena lingered in the back hallway, her small fingers grazing the peeling paint of the wall until the echo of polished shoes and chatter faded. She could not bear to step through the main doors, not after Henderson's words still clung to her like smoke. Instead, she slipped out through a side exit, where the bricks bore the faint marks of generations of chalk graffiti long washed away by rain. The October air bit against her cheeks, sharp and restless, but she welcomed it. The street outside was a different kind of classroom, one where she could breathe. Elena turned east onto 53rd Street, keeping her head low. The avenue hummed with life, students with backpacks heavy with books, professors in tweed coats, the fragrance of roasted coffee drifting from cafes. On one corner, a street musician coaxed a mournful melody from his saxophone. Elena passed quickly, her worn boots making almost no sound, as if she wished to remain invisible. But inside her head, she was anything but invisible. The unfinished problem from the blackboard still flickered in her mind, each number alive, shifting like constellations. She had carried it with her since morning, unable to release it, as though it had imprinted itself on her very pulse. The solution was clear, elegant even. Yet she had been denied the chance to speak it aloud. The silence had bruised her deeper than Henderson's words. She pressed on until the cafes gave way to narrow alleys and brick warehouses. At the corner of Harper Avenue stood the place she truly sought, Joseph Washington's garage. The building looked almost forgotten by time. The sign was cracked, the letters Washington, N Auto, missing their O. The windows, streaked with oil, reflected the afternoon light in warped fragments. To most, it was a relic, an eyesore squeezed between modern storefronts. To Elena, it was sanctuary. She pushed open the heavy metal door, and the scent enveloped her. Oil, rust, gasoline, and the faint sweetness of rubber. It was the smell of possibility, of hidden worlds waiting to be unlocked. Inside, Joseph Washington, tall and broad-shouldered though now slowed by age, leaned under the hood of a Buick with the patience of a man reading scripture. His hair was silver, his hands roughened by decades of labor. When he heard the door creak, he straightened, wiping his hands on a rag. "Little engineer," he said, a grin breaking through the grease on his cheeks.
"You made it."
Elena smiled faintly. The nickname never failed to lift her. In this place, she was not charity case or unfit for advanced programs. She was apprentice, dreamer, mind in the making. Joseph tossed her a pair of overalls, far too big, sleeves and pant legs hanging loose. She slipped into them eagerly. The fabric smelled faintly of oil and old fabric, but when she rolled up the cuffs and tied the waist with twine, it felt like armor. "Today," Joseph said, leading her toward the workbench, "we tackle gears." On the table lay a dismantled transmission, gears of various sizes arranged like pieces of a puzzle. Their teeth glinted in the light that streamed through the grimy window. Elena leaned forward, tracing a finger along the grooves. She could see motion before it happened, torque translating into rotation, energy whispering from one wheel to the next. Joseph watched her closely. "You see it, don't you? Not just the pieces, but the dance." Elena nodded, her eyes wide. "It's like they're speaking to each other." Joseph chuckled. "A conversation of steel, and you, girl, you're already fluent." For the next hour, the garage became her classroom. Joseph explained the basics, how the clutch engaged, how the gears meshed to multiply torque, how the balance of force determined whether a vehicle moved or stalled. Elena listened, but more than that, she imagined. She imagined faster alignments, smoother transitions, possibilities no one else seemed to notice. At one point, she picked up a scrap of paper and began sketching, her pencil darting with certainty. When she finished, she handed it to Joseph. It was a simple drawing, yet startling in its insight, a modification that could reduce slippage in the gearbox by adjusting the angle of the teeth. Joseph froze, staring at the page. His lips parted, but no words came for a long moment. Finally, he whispered, "Do you know what you've done, child? This is not repair. This is invention." Elena lowered her gaze, embarrassed by the intensity of his tone. "I just thought it might work better this way." "Better," Joseph repeated, shaking his head in wonder. "You're thinking like an engineer from MIT." The words sent a shiver through Elena. She had heard of MIT, though only as a distant legend, a place where brilliance gathered, where machines and ideas were born. To be compared to such a place felt like standing on the edge of a vast new horizon. Yet she said nothing, for fear of sounding foolish. The garage door rattled as a car drove past outside. Elena inhaled the oil-tinged air and let the moment settle. Here, in this forgotten corner of Hyde Park, she had found her true classroom. As the sun dipped lower, Joseph set down his tools. "Little engineer," he said softly, "there will come a day when the world tries to tell you what you are not. But remember this, machines don't lie. If you understand them, if you solve their riddles, they'll prove you belong anywhere you choose to go." Elena met his gaze, and for the first time that day, she believed it might be true. That evening, as she walked home, the city lights flickered to life. Cafes glowed with warmth, the L train rumbled overhead, and the lake wind pressed against her coat. Elena tightened her grip on the sketch she carried in her pocket, the blueprint of a gear no one had asked her to draw. At her side, the promise from the classroom still burned. One day, they will see me. But now it had grown sharper, heavier, more alive. For in Joseph's garage, amidst the smell of grease and the clang of tools, she had glimpsed her future, and it was not silence. It was fire. The garage on Harper Avenue was quiet that Saturday morning, the air damp with the smell of dew mixed with gasoline. Elena arrived early, her boots leaving faint imprints on the cracked pavement. In her pocket, she carried the stub of a pencil and several scraps of paper she had rescued from her grandmother's sewing basket. To her, these scraps were treasure, blank space where ideas could take form. Joseph Washington was already at work, leaning over a battered truck that had been towed in the night before. His frame was heavy, his movements slower with age, but his eyes lit when he saw the girl. "Morning, little engineer," he said, motioning her closer. "I've got something today that might test your head." The vehicle belonged to the Reynolds family, who owned one of the larger grocery suppliers in Hyde Park. Their delivery truck had broken down, again. The gearbox slipped, grinding when it shifted, wasting fuel and threatening to strand their drivers. Joseph sighed. He had repaired the same problem twice before, yet the flaw kept returning like an old ghost. "Sometimes machines are stubborn," Joseph muttered, wiping his hands. "You fix one thing, they find another way to fail." Elena circled the truck slowly, her eyes taking in every detail. The faint grease stains near the clutch, the sound of the gears when Joseph tried to start it, the pattern of wear on the transmission case. To her, these were not random signs. They were sentences in a language she was still learning to read, but which already whispered to her more clearly than the taunts of children in class. "May I see the gearbox drawing?" she asked timidly. Joseph raised an eyebrow but rummaged for an old manual, its pages yellowed and smudged. He spread it across the workbench. Diagrams of gears filled the page, their teeth meshing in neat precision. Elena traced them with her finger, lips moving silently as though reciting a poem. Then she took her pencil stub and began sketching. Her hand moved quickly, sure of itself. She adjusted the angle of the secondary gear teeth, shifted the alignment by a fraction, and added a reinforcing groove. The design was crude, the lines uneven, but the idea was unmistakable. Joseph leaned over her shoulder, and his breath caught. "Child," he whispered, "you're thinking like someone who's seen beyond the steel." Elena shook her head. "I just thought, if the torque keeps slipping here, then maybe the angle is wrong. If it were sharper, the teeth would catch better." Joseph stared at her sketch. "That's not repair. That's redesign." The word echoed in Elena's chest. Redesign. It sounded dangerous, daring, almost forbidden. Who was she, the daughter of a janitor, to imagine she could improve upon machines built by engineers? And yet, hadn't she already seen it in her mind's eye, the way the gears would lock, the smoothness that would follow? Joseph placed a heavy hand on her shoulder. I once knew men at General Motors who spent months trying to solve slippage like this. And here you are, 10 years old, drawing it in 5 minutes. The compliment made her cheeks burn, but also filled her with a fierce, quiet pride. They spent the rest of the morning experimenting. Joseph cut a small piece of metal, filing the edge to match Elena's drawing. Together, they fitted it into the gearbox, their hands working side by side. The machine groaned in protest at first. Then, as Joseph shifted through the gears, the sound changed. The grinding lessened, the slippage eased. The truck hummed as though relieved. Joseph laughed aloud, the sound booming in the garage. "It works!" he shouted. "It bloody works!" Elena's heart soared. She clutched the dirty rag in her hand, her eyes wide with wonder. For the first time, her idea had leapt from paper into steel, and the steel had answered. Yet beneath the triumph, she sensed something else, a ripple of unease. If Henderson or anyone from school saw her here, covered in grease, they would sneer. They would call it play, not learning. They would dismiss it as the dabbling of a janitor's child. But Elena knew better. She knew what it felt like to wrestle with a problem, to bend it until it yielded. And she knew that this was education in its purest form. Later, as Joseph closed up shop, he looked at her seriously. "Elena, listen to me," he said. "You've got a gift, but gifts like yours make people uneasy. They don't like it when brilliance comes from unexpected places. You'll need courage more than you think." She met his eyes. "I already promised myself," she whispered. "One day, they will see me." Joseph nodded, but his brow furrowed. He knew promises were fragile when tested against the weight of the world. That evening, Elena returned home to the small apartment above a laundromat. Her grandmother, Rosa, sat darning socks by the window, the lamplight soft on her wrinkled hands. When Elena showed her the sketch, Rosa's eyes misted. "Your father had that same fire," she said softly. "He could see how things fit together, but he never had the chance." Doors stayed closed, no matter how hard he knocked. Elena held the drawing tighter. "Then I'll break the doors." Rosa smiled sadly, smoothing the child's hair. "Just don't let the world break you first." Days passed, and word spread quietly through Hyde Park. The Reynolds truck ran smoother than it had in years, thanks to a mystery fix from Washington's garage. Joseph kept Elena's role a secret, partly to protect her, partly because he knew the world would not believe it. But fate was not done with them. One afternoon, the garage door creaked open, and a sleek Mercedes rolled in. Its paint gleamed bow, its chrome sparkled, but smoke curled faintly from under the hood. Joseph frowned, moving to greet the driver. And then he froze. For stepping out of the car, heels clicking against the concrete, was none other than Eleanor Henderson. Her sharp eyes scanned the garage, landing on Elena, who stood near the workbench in her oversized overalls, grease smudged on her cheek. Recognition flickered, followed by horror. Henderson's face hardened. "What are you doing here?" she demanded. Elena's heart pounded, but she straightened her back. The gears of courage shifted inside her, locking into place, because this time she knew something Henderson did not. The machine was broken, and she could fix it. The garage smelled of smoke and steel that afternoon, the kind of smell that clung to clothes long after you left. Elena stood near the workbench, wiping her hands on a rag too big for her small fingers, when the polished Mercedes rolled to a stop inside. The engine hissed, smoke curling like a secret trying to escape. Eleanor Henderson stepped out, her heels striking the oil-stained floor with sharp authority. Her tailored jacket still carried the scent of expensive perfume, a fragrance utterly alien in this place of grease and grit. She had come expecting a seasoned mechanic, perhaps Joseph Washington himself, to solve her problem discreetly. Instead, her eyes landed on the one face she least expected: Elena Alvarez, the janitor's daughter, her student. The recognition was immediate, and Henderson's reaction visceral. Her lips thinned, her brows furrowed, and her voice cracked with alarm. "You? What are you doing here?" Elena froze, the rag twisting in her hands. Heat rose in her cheeks, but she stood her ground. "I help Mr. Washington after school," she said quietly. Henderson's laugh was short, sharp, dismissive. "So this is where you belong, covered in grease, tinkering like a child pretending to be useful." Her gaze swept the garage with disdain. "I should have known." Joseph emerged from behind the Buick, his expression wary. "Afternoon, ma'am. Car trouble?" Henderson turned to him, her face softening into the mask she reserved for those she deemed respectable. "The engine keeps overheating," she explained. "Smoke, rattling, a strange knocking sound. I need it fixed immediately." Joseph nodded, but before he could move closer, Elena spoke. Her voice, though soft, carried conviction. "It's not the radiator," she said. "It's the timing belt slipping on the camshaft. That's why it rattles when the revs climb. The smoke is just unburned fuel escaping because the timing is off." The garage fell silent. Henderson's eyes narrowed. "Excuse me?" Elena swallowed hard, but continued. "If you ignore it, the belt could snap. Then the valves and pistons will collide and the whole engine will be destroyed." She pointed toward the hood. "That's what the knocking means." Joseph looked from the car to Elena, surprise flashing in his eyes. Her diagnosis had been immediate, precise, and, he knew instinctively, correct. He opened the hood, checked the belt, and after only a few moments, whistled under his breath. "She's right," he said. "Timing belt's worn clean through. Another 100 miles and you'd be walking instead of driving." For the first time since entering the garage, Henderson's confidence faltered. Her gaze darted from Joseph to Elena, and a flicker of uncertainty crossed her face. But pride returned quickly, shoring up her composure. "Even if she guessed right this time," Henderson said coldly, "a child has no business diagnosing automobiles, especially not this child." Her words stung, sharper than the smoke in the air. But Elena did not retreat. She lifted her chin, her dark eyes steady. "Machines don't care who's looking at them," she said. "They only care who understands them." The words hung in the air, heavy, undeniable. For a brief moment, even Joseph felt the shift, the kind of moment when truth slices through pretense. Henderson blinked, visibly unsettled. She opened her mouth, searching for a retort, but none came. The silence pressed in, broken only by the ticking of the cooling engine. Finally, Henderson turned away, as if the conversation itself were beneath her. "Just fix it," she ordered curtly, tossing her keys onto the workbench. Joseph caught Elena's eye, offering the faintest nod of respect. He had seen her bravery, her clarity, her refusal to shrink in the face of contempt. The repair took hours. Joseph handled the heavy lifting, but Elena was there every step, handing tools, checking alignments, even recalculating torque settings. She explained her reasoning in calm, precise tones, as though presenting an argument no one could refute. Henderson watched from the corner, her arms crossed tightly, her heels tapping against the concrete with impatience. And yet, beneath her mask of disdain, Henderson observed. She saw the way Elena's small hands moved with confidence, the way her eyes lit up when she explained how the gears meshed, how the engine breathed. She saw for the first time not just a charity case, but a mind alive with fire. Still, Henderson resisted the recognition. To admit it would mean unraveling years of certainty, years in which she had dismissed children like Elena, convinced they lacked foundation, discipline, worth. To admit Elena's brilliance would be to confront her own blindness. As Joseph tightened the last bolt and closed the hood, the engine roared back to life, smooth and steady. Henderson's Mercedes purred like a satisfied cat. The smoke cleared. The knocking was gone. Joseph stepped back, wiping his hands. "Good as new," he said. "But truth be told, you should thank her." He nodded toward Elena. Henderson's jaw clenched. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, with forced politeness, she replied, "Well, perhaps even broken clocks are right twice a day." Elena's stomach tightened, but she did not flinch. She had expected no gratitude, only resistance. Still, a seed had been planted, and she knew it. That night, Elena lay awake in her small bed, staring at the ceiling. Henderson's words still echoed, but so did her own. Machines don't care who's looking at them. They only care who understands them. She repeated the phrase like a prayer, a shield against the world's contempt. Outside, the city hummed with its endless rhythm, trains clattering on tracks, wind off Lake Michigan rattling windows, sirens in the distance. Elena listened, her heart steady. She had faced Henderson in her world of authority and emerged unbroken. More than that, she had been heard, if only for a flicker of a moment. And in that flicker, she sensed the beginning of something larger, an opening crack in a wall built of prejudice and silence. She closed her eyes and whispered to herself, "One day, that wall will fall." The following Monday, University of Chicago Elementary seemed colder than usual. The hallways smelled faintly of chalk and disinfectant, and the autumn wind pressed against the tall windows as if the city itself wanted to intrude on the silence. Elena walked with her books clutched tight to her chest, her footsteps soft against the polished floor. She knew Henderson had seen her in the garage, had watched her diagnose the Mercedes with uncanny precision. But she also knew Henderson would not forget easily. The moment came sooner than she expected. During math class, Henderson stood before the blackboard, chalk in hand, her jaw tight. The room was filled with the low murmur of privileged children shifting in their seats, ready to prove themselves under her approving gaze. Without preamble, Henderson scrawled a problem across the board, a tangle of equations more complex than usual, designed to intimidate. "Who will solve this?" she asked, her tone sharp, her eyes scanning the room. Elena's hand lifted slowly. Her heart pounded, but she held it steady. Henderson's gaze landed on her, and the corners of her lips curled. "No," she said flatly, ignoring the raised hand. "Someone else." A boy named Carter, whose father donated generously to the school, was chosen instead. He hesitated, stumbling through the first few steps before faltering completely. Henderson corrected him gently, glossing over the error, then handed the chalk to Maria, whose family owned a bookstore on 57th Street. She too failed, blushing under the weight of expectation. Still, Elena's hand remained raised. Finally, Henderson turned, her eyes cold. "You want to try?" she asked, her voice dripping with challenge. Elena rose, her legs trembling but her gaze steady. She walked to the board, the room falling into a hush. The chalk felt heavy in her small hand, but the numbers before her were clear, alive, almost eager to be solved. She began to write, her strokes precise, her logic unfolding step by step. In minutes, the problem unraveled. What had seemed a wall of confusion dissolved into clarity under her hand. She set the chalk down, turning to face the room. The silence was absolute. Then Henderson spoke, her voice cutting like a blade. "Impressive, but let us be realistic." She stepped forward, her heels striking the floor with authority. "Children like you, charity cases, don't need advanced mathematics. You need to learn skills you can actually use. Practical skills, repair work, housekeeping. Maybe, if you are fortunate, secretarial training. A murmur spread through the room. Some students looked away, ashamed. Others smirked, sensing permission to dismiss Elena again. Elena's chest burned. She thought of the garage, of Joseph's trust, of the gearbox humming with new life. She thought of her grandmother's weary hands sewing late into the night, and she thought of the promise she had whispered, "One day they will see me." Her voice shook at first, but grew stronger with each word. "Machines don't ask who I am," she said. "They don't ask where I live or what my last name is. They only ask if I can solve the problem. And I can." The class gasped. No one had ever spoken back to Henderson in such a way. Henderson's face flushed crimson. For a moment, she seemed ready to explode. But then she drew herself up, her expression icy. Bold words. But boldness is not a substitute for pedigree. The world has rules, Miss Alvarez, and you would be wise to learn them. Elena met her gaze. Maybe the rules are wrong. The silence that followed was electric, charged with something larger than the room itself. It was as if the walls of the classroom trembled with the weight of unspoken truths, that brilliance could emerge anywhere, that the boundaries drawn by privilege were nothing but illusions. Henderson turned sharply, dismissing the class with a wave. "That's enough for today." Her voice was clipped, brittle, betraying the crack that Elena's words had opened. That evening, Elena returned to the garage, her steps quick, her breath shallow. Joseph looked up from under the hood of a car and immediately saw the storm in her eyes. "What happened?" he asked. Elena told him everything, the problem on the board, Henderson's cutting words, her own defiance. When she finished, Joseph wiped his hands and studied her closely. "You know what you did today?" he said finally. "I spoke the truth," Elena replied. Joseph nodded. "And truth is dangerous. It rattles the cages of those who built them. But never stop speaking it." Elena exhaled, the tension easing slightly. She picked up a wrench and joined Joseph at the workbench, her hands steady now. The machines, at least, would never lie to her. Meanwhile, Henderson sat alone in her apartment, a glass of wine untouched on the table. She replayed the moment in her mind, the child's defiance, the way the class had looked at her. For the first time in years, she felt the sting of doubt. Had she been wrong? Had she silenced brilliance out of prejudice? She tried to dismiss the thought, but Elena's words echoed. Maybe the rules are wrong. The rules had always protected her, upheld her authority, validated her judgment. If those rules were wrong, then what did that make her? She set the glass down with trembling hands. The next day at school, whispers followed Elena through the hallways. Some students avoided her. Others watched her with newfound curiosity. Word of her defiance had spread. She was no longer invisible. But visibility brought danger. Henderson's pride had been wounded, and wounded pride rarely healed quietly. For Elena, the classroom had become a battlefield. Yet she was not afraid, because somewhere inside, she knew this was only the beginning, that her fight was not against a single teacher, but against the invisible machinery of prejudice itself. And like every machine she had ever studied, it could be understood. It could be dismantled. The garage smelled of oil and rust that Thursday evening, but to Elena, it was the fragrance of freedom. She arrived just as the sun dipped behind the rooftops of Hyde Park, painting the brick walls in dusky red. Her school bag still weighed on her shoulders, but her mind felt lighter once she stepped into Joseph's domain. Joseph was tightening bolts on an old Ford pickup, humming softly, when he saw her. "Evening, little engineer," he said. Your timing is perfect. I've got something for you. He pointed toward the corner of the garage. There sat Mrs. Green, an elderly neighbor with a worried look. Her car, a faded blue sedan, had failed her earlier that week. She had come not only for repair but also for understanding. I told her you might explain what's happening, Joseph said, his eyes twinkling. Think of it as practice. Elena blinked. Me? Yes, you. Teaching's not so different from fixing a machine. You find the pieces that don't connect, and you build a bridge. Hesitant, Elena led Mrs. Green to the workbench. The older woman wrung her hands, embarrassed. I've never understood cars. I only know it won't stop when I press the pedal, and that scares me. Elena nodded gently. That's not silly. That's the most important part. Understanding what frightens you. She reached for a kettle Joseph used to boil water for tea, setting it on the bench. Think of your brake system like this kettle. When it boils, steam builds pressure. If you press a valve here, she tapped the spout, the pressure is released, and the kettle stops hissing. That's your brake fluid. It builds pressure, then pushes on the pads that slow the wheels. If there's a leak, the pressure escapes. That's why your pedal feels soft, like pressing air. Mrs. Green's eyes widened in recognition. So it's not magic. It's pressure. Exactly. Elena smiled, her voice steady now. And once you know the principle, you don't have to be afraid. You can even tell a mechanic exactly what's wrong, so no one tricks you. Joseph, leaning in the background, chuckled. You've got the makings of a teacher, girl. But what Elena did not know was that someone else had been watching. Eleanor Henderson had not intended to come to the garage again. Pride told her to avoid the place, to forget the embarrassment of the Mercedes, to pretend the janitor's daughter did not exist outside the classroom. But curiosity gnawed at her. She told herself it was professional duty, that she needed to understand why the child's defiance unsettled her so deeply. So she had come quietly, standing just outside the open garage door, her coat wrapped tightly against the chill. She watched from the shadows as Elena explained the brake system with nothing but a kettle and her own imagination. For the first time, Henderson saw not just a student, but a mind alive with clarity. She saw how the child bridged knowledge and fear, how she transformed confusion into confidence. And in that moment, Henderson's heart betrayed her. She felt a sting behind her eyes, a heat she had not allowed herself in years. She blinked hard, willing the tears away. But they came anyway. Inside, Elena continued her explanation, her confidence growing with every nod of understanding from Mrs. Green. She pointed to the diagrams Joseph had pinned to the wall, relating each line to something simple, something familiar. Pressure, release, motion, resistance. By the end, Mrs. Green was smiling. You've given me more peace than any mechanic ever has, she said softly. Elena's chest swelled with quiet pride, not just for solving a problem, but for giving someone else the power to understand. When Mrs. Green left, Joseph clapped Elena gently on the shoulder. Did you see what you did? That woman came in frightened. She left stronger. That's more valuable than any repair. Elena beamed, but Joseph noticed something else, the faint shuffle of shoes outside the door. He stepped forward, catching sight of Henderson standing rigid in the shadows. Their eyes met. Henderson looked stricken, as though caught trespassing in a world she was not meant to see. She turned quickly, disappearing down the street without a word. Joseph said nothing to Elena. Some truths, he knew, had to arrive on their own. That night, Henderson sat alone in her apartment once again, staring at the city skyline through her window. She thought of Elena's hands, small, stained with grease, moving with authority. She thought of the kettle, the metaphor, the simple brilliance of translating complexity into clarity. Her mind, so long trained to see poverty as deficiency, faltered. She remembered the countless students she had dismissed over the years, convinced they lacked potential because they lacked polish. How many Elenas had she silenced? How many had walked away carrying fire in their chests, only to let it smolder unseen? The tears returned, unbidden this time. For the first time in decades, Eleanor Henderson doubted not the child, but herself. Back in the Alvarez apartment, Rosa was tucking Elena into bed. The old woman's voice was soft, her Spanish lilt warm as she whispered, "Nunca dejes que te apaguen, mija. Don't let them dim your light." Elena nodded sleepily, but her mind still hummed with the sound of the garage, with Mrs. Green's smile, with Joseph's words. She felt the truth settle deep within her. She was not only meant to solve problems, she was meant to teach others how to solve them too. And though she did not know it yet, Henderson had already begun to change. The wall was beginning to crack. The morning of the hearing broke gray and restless over the city. Wind rushed in from Lake Michigan, rattling the branches along 53rd Street, carrying with it the scent of cold water and iron. In a small apartment above a laundromat, Elena Alvarez dressed in her best. The patched sweater Rosa had mended, brushed clean until it shone faintly in the weak light. Her grandmother smoothed the shoulders with trembling hands.
You will not stand alone,
Rosa whispered. Yet Elena knew the truth. She would. At the headquarters of Chicago Public Schools, a stone building that smelled faintly of polished wood and bureaucracy, the board gathered in a long chamber. Rows of chairs stretched back toward a gallery of parents, teachers, and reporters. At the front, beneath the seal of the district, sat the 7 members of the board, men and women whose expressions had been hardened by years of hearings. Their suits were pressed, their pens poised, their smiles careful. At Henderson's side, Elena sat small and silent, her feet barely touching the floor. She felt the weight of eyes pressing down, eyes that measured her not by what she could do, but by where she came from. The hearing began with the board chair's gavel. Next matter. Review of student placement in advanced programs. Teacher Eleanor Henderson requests reconsideration of student Elena Alvarez. Whispers rippled through the audience. Some parents frowned, others smirked. Henderson stood, her posture stiff, but her voice steady. I come before you today to acknowledge a mistake. For years, I have taught under the belief that only children from certain backgrounds were prepared for advanced study. I was wrong. Elena Alvarez, a janitor's daughter, has demonstrated brilliance that surpasses her peers. Her aptitude in mathematics and mechanics is not anecdote, it is evidence. She laid a folder on the table. Inside were Elena's test scores, consistent 99th percentile. Essays marked with precision. Notes from Joseph Washington, the mechanic, attesting to Elena's engineering sketches. Her gifts, Henderson continued, cannot be ignored. To deny her is not only to wound one child, it is to betray the mission of public education itself. A murmur of discontent rose from the gallery. A man in an expensive coat stood abruptly. This is outrageous. My son studies 3 hours every night for that program, and you suggest this charity case, deserves the same seat. Another parent chimed in, her pearls catching the light. We pay taxes, donations, contributions. Our children should not be pushed aside for experiments. The board chair raised a hand. Order. This is a hearing, not a shouting match. But the protests had already begun. Henderson's voice cut through the noise. I once believed what you believe, that excellence has an address, that pedigree ensures potential. But I saw Elena solve problems my best students could not. I saw her diagnose complex systems with an instinct that even trained engineers respect. I cannot stay silent, not after what I witnessed. Her eyes flicked toward Elena, then back to the board. If I must sacrifice my reputation to defend her, so be it. But the truth will not change. For the first time, Elena looked up. Henderson's words, spoken with conviction, pierced the shell of contempt she had come to expect. The board chair adjusted his glasses. "Miss Alvarez," he said, "do you wish to speak?" Elena's breath caught. The gallery's eyes turned on her, heavy, skeptical. Her grandmother's words echoed in her mind. "You will not stand alone." She rose slowly. Her hands shook, but her voice was clear. "Excellence has no zip code," she said. "It does not ask what clothes you wear or who your parents are. My father was a janitor at the University of Chicago. He was brilliant with machines, but no one gave him a chance. He died with his talent buried. I will not let mine be buried too." The room stilled. She took a step closer to the microphone. "I am not asking for special treatment. I am asking you to see what is already there. If you measure me, measure my work, test me, watch me solve. But don't dismiss me because my sweater is patched. Don't dismiss me because my grandmother cleans floors. The world loses too much brilliance that way." Her words hung in the air like a verdict no gavel could erase. A board member leaned forward, frowning. "But how do we ensure fairness? If we open the doors too wide, standards will erode." Elena answered before Henderson could. "Fairness is not lowering the bar. Fairness is letting everyone reach it." A hush fell. Even the angry parents had no quick retort. In the gallery, Joseph Washington shifted, his massive hands folded across his chest. He had come quietly, taking a seat in the back, unseen until now. His voice, when it came, rolled like distant thunder. "She is no charity," he said. "She rebuilt a gearbox design that Detroit engineers struggled with. She sees things others miss. If you ignore her, it won't be her loss. It'll be yours." The board chair banged the gavel again. "Order!" But order had already shifted. The air in the room had changed, charged by truth. The debate raged on. Parents protested. Henderson argued. Board members questioned, doubted, scribbled notes. Yet through it all, Elena sat straight-backed, her eyes steady, her hands clenched around her notebook as though it were a lifeline. Finally, the chair spoke. "We will deliberate. A decision will be issued within the week." The gavel fell, and the hearing was adjourned. Outside, the cold air hit Elena's face like a wave. She breathed deeply, her chest heaving with both exhaustion and triumph. Henderson emerged beside her, pale but resolute. For a long moment they stood in silence. Then Henderson spoke, her voice low. "You reminded me today why I became a teacher. Not to protect gates, but to open them." Elena looked at her, uncertain. The woman who had once humiliated her now stood as her defender. The world was shifting beneath her feet. Behind them, Joseph stepped forward. "The fight's not over," he said. "They'll push back. Systems don't break easy. But you've made the first crack." Elena nodded, her breath visible in the cold air. The promise she had whispered weeks ago, "One day they will see me," was no longer just a whisper. It was a declaration, and for the first time, others had heard it. The week dragged on like a trial without end. Each morning, Elena sat in Henderson's classroom, aware of the whispers that followed her. Some students now looked at her with quiet respect, others with sharpened envy, but all of them watched. Henderson, for her part, was different too, less rigid, her eyes lingering longer on Elena as though still trying to reconcile the child before her with the truth she had seen in the garage. On Friday, a message came. The board had requested Elena return. Her grandmother held her hands tightly before they left the apartment. "Speak with courage, mija. Your voice is stronger than you know." The boardroom was even more crowded this time. Reporters filled the back rows, notebooks ready. Parents in polished shoes and heavy coats whispered among themselves, their voices tinged with irritation. To them, this was not merely about one child. It was about who controlled the gates of opportunity. The chair called the meeting to order. "We have heard testimony from faculty and community members. Today, we will hear directly from the student in question, Miss Elena Alvarez." All eyes turned to her. Elena rose slowly, the weight of the moment pressing against her small frame. Yet inside, something steadied, like gears aligning after a long struggle. She walked to the microphone, her patched sweater visible under the harsh lights. Her voice was soft at first. "Thank you for letting me speak." She paused, her gaze sweeping the room. "You asked if I deserve a place in the advanced program, but this is not just about me. It is about every child you do not see." A ripple moved through the crowd. "My father was a janitor at the University of Chicago," Elena continued. "He was brilliant with machines. He could look at a broken engine and know its secret. But no one ever gave him the chance to study. He died with that brilliance buried, unseen, unheard. I do not want his story to be mine, or anyone else's." She drew a breath, her small hands gripping the podium. "Excellence has no zip code. Talent is not owned by neighborhoods or last names or bank accounts. It can live anywhere, even in a janitor's daughter, even in a patched sweater." Her words echoed, sharp as steel. "I am not here only to ask for a seat. I am here to ask for change. 3 changes." She held up a finger. "First, measure progress, not just pedigree. Test us by what we can do, not where we come from. Second, look beyond the textbook. Talent shows itself in drawings, in experiments, in the way a child solves problems outside the classroom. Do not ignore that. And third, build a pipeline of opportunity. Do not wait for children like me to beg for a chance. Create programs that search for us, nurture us, and prepare us to rise." The board members shifted uneasily. Some scribbled notes. Others leaned back, their expressions unreadable. A parent stood abruptly, voice sharp. "This is absurd. She is 10 years old. What does she know about pipelines or systems?" Elena turned toward him, her gaze unwavering. "I know what it feels like to be locked out. And I know what it feels like when someone opens the door. That is enough." The room hushed. In the gallery, Joseph Washington felt his chest swell. He had taught her gears and torque, but she was teaching him courage. Beside him, Rosa wiped her eyes with a handkerchief, whispering prayers in Spanish. Even Henderson sat rigid, her hands clenched, her face pale. She had never imagined the girl would speak like this, clear, fearless, cutting through decades of prejudice with a voice that trembled yet never broke. Elena turned back to the board. "You can choose to ignore me. You can say I am too young, too poor, too small. But if you do, you will not just lose me. You will lose hundreds like me, children who could solve problems you do not even see yet. Children who could build bridges, cure diseases, design machines, answer questions that still torment your best universities." Her words struck like blows. She thought of the Navier-Stokes problem, the turbulence equations whispered about in graduate halls, the kind of mysteries she longed to touch. She could not yet solve them, but she knew that one day someone like her might. If only the door was left open. Do not bury another generation's brilliance under silence, she finished. Do not bury me. The silence that followed was heavier than any gavel. For a moment, even the most hardened board members looked unsettled. The chair cleared his throat, fumbling for composure. Thank you, Miss Alvarez. Your words will be taken into consideration. But Elena did not sit immediately. She looked out at the room. The parents, the students, the teachers, and she saw not hostility alone, but something else flickering at the edges, uncertainty, curiosity, even admiration. Only then did she return to her seat. Outside, the city lights blinked to life against the falling dusk. Henderson walked beside Elena in silence. At last, she spoke, her voice low and unsteady. You have done what I could not, she admitted. You made them listen. Elena looked up at her, eyes dark, but shining. They have to see. Not just me. All of us. Henderson stopped walking, her breath visible in the cold air. She realized with sudden clarity that this child had already outgrown her, had leapt beyond the narrow frame Henderson had once built. The system had been challenged. The first stones had shifted. And somewhere deep inside, Henderson felt the wall begin to tremble. The board had not yet announced its decision, but something had already changed. The air inside University of Chicago Elementary felt different, charged with a quiet current that rippled through every desk, every notebook, every whispered exchange between children. It began with Eleanor Henderson herself. She entered the classroom no longer with the same rigid authority, but with a pause, a hesitation that suggested the old order had cracked. For years, she had believed she held the keys to excellence, unlocking doors for some and keeping them barred for others. But after watching Elena stand before the board and speak like a leader twice her age, Henderson could not ignore the truth. The doors had never belonged to her. On Monday morning, she set down her chalk and looked out at the rows of expectant faces. For the first time in decades, she saw them not as categories, wealthy, poor, gifted, average, but as uncut stone, each with hidden brilliance waiting to be revealed. Today, she said slowly, we're going to try something different. The children exchanged uncertain glances. Henderson wrote a problem on the board, but instead of calling on Carter or Maria or the other usual favorites, she turned to Elena. Elena, she said, her voice firm but no longer sharp, would you lead the class? A stunned silence filled the room. Elena's heart thudded. Slowly she rose, her patched sweater pulling tight at the elbows, her notebook clutched like a talisman. She walked to the front, every step heavy with memory. Henderson's shout, "Get out, you don't belong here," still echoing in her mind. But Henderson's eyes now held something different. Not contempt, not dismissal. Something that looked almost like trust. Elena faced the class. She lifted the chalk with trembling fingers, then turned to the board. The problem was familiar. A system of equations. She explained carefully, her voice soft but clear, her reasoning unfolding step by step. And as she spoke, she did not merely solve, she taught. She used metaphors, comparisons, small jokes that made even the most distracted students lean in. When she finished, Maria raised her hand. Could you show me another way? Elena nodded, and without hesitation offered a second method, then a third. Each time the chalk sang against the board, the numbers blossoming into patterns that revealed themselves with surprising grace. For the first time, the classroom leaned toward her, not in pity, not in curiosity, but in genuine awe. In the days that followed, Henderson began to dismantle her own habits. She instituted peer teaching, allowing students to lead groups in subjects they excelled at. Elena guided mathematics, breaking down complex problems with patience. Maria, fluent in both English and Spanish, led a group in languages. Aisha, who loved science, created simple experiments for her classmates. The rigid hierarchy of the classroom began to dissolve. The students who once sat silently at the edges found their voices. Carter, who had always relied on his father's prestige, now struggled under the new order. But even he learned, slowly, that collaboration required humility. The walls that had once separated them by wealth, status, and teachers' approval began to crumble. In their place grew a community of learners, each contributing, each recognized. One afternoon, Elena stood at the board demonstrating the concept of ratios using gears Joseph had given her from the garage. She passed the small, grease-stained cogs around, letting each child feel their weight, turn their teeth, watch how they meshed. The lesson was alive. Numbers became motion. Motion became understanding. Henderson sat at her desk, watching, her throat tight. She thought of all the years she had silenced children like this. She thought of all the voices she had buried under the weight of not ready and not suitable. And for the first time she wept openly in her classroom. The transformation did not go unnoticed. Parents whispered, confused by the sudden shift in reports their children brought home. Some resisted, unhappy that their privileges no longer guaranteed them the spotlight. But others marveled at the change. Children once timid now spoke confidently at the dinner table, explaining concepts with clarity they had never shown before. The principal visited one afternoon, standing quietly at the back of the room. He watched as Elena guided her peers through a logic puzzle, then stepped aside to let Aisha explain the scientific principle behind a homemade water filter. The principal's brow furrowed, then lifted in surprise. By the time he left, he knew something extraordinary was happening in Henderson's classroom. For Elena, the change was both exhilarating and terrifying. She had gone from outcast to leader in a matter of weeks. Some classmates still muttered behind her back, whispering "janitor's kid" with bitterness, but others began to defend her. "She knows what she's talking about," Maria said once, loud enough for the class to hear. "Better than most adults I know." The words warmed Elena more than she could admit, yet she also knew the fight was far from over. The board still had not rendered its verdict. Her place in the advanced program hung in the balance. Henderson's newfound support was fragile, always under scrutiny from powerful parents who saw Elena as a threat to their children's supremacy. But each day in the classroom was proof. The old walls could fall. One evening, as Elena packed her books, Henderson approached her quietly. "You've changed this classroom," she said. "I didn't believe it was possible, but you did." Elena looked up, uncertain. "I just wanted to solve problems." Henderson's eyes softened. "Sometimes the greatest problem is not numbers or machines, but people's hearts. And you've solved more than you know." The words settled in Elena's chest, heavy and luminous. She thought again of her father, denied his chance. She thought of her grandmother, stitching hope into every patch, and she thought of Joseph, whose garage had been her true first classroom. She whispered to herself, "One day they will see me." But now, for the first time, she realized they already were. Winter crept into Chicago with its familiar sharpness, the wind slicing through streets lined with Gothic spires and modern glass. Snow dusted the sidewalks near the university, catching in the collars of hurried students and swirling around the feet of janitors pushing their carts into the night. Elena walked through that same wind, her patched sweater pulled tight, her grandmother's scarf wrapped around her neck. Yet her steps were light, as though she carried not the cold, but a secret flame. The verdict had come. The board had accepted her into the citywide advanced program. It was written in careful bureaucratic language, but the meaning was clear. Elena Alvarez, Janitor's daughter, had broken through a door meant to stay closed. Her grandmother Rosa wept openly when the letter arrived, clutching Elena's hands and whispering prayers of thanks. Joseph Washington roared with laughter, pounding the workbench so hard that a wrench clattered to the floor. Even Henderson, stiff, pale Henderson, stood before the class with tears in her eyes as she announced it. For Elena, the letter was more than acceptance. It was vindication. Proof that her father's buried brilliance had not been wasted. Proof that patched sweaters and calloused hands could still hold genius. The months that followed brought transformation. At Joseph's garage, children from the neighborhood began to gather. At first, they came timidly, curious boys and girls trailing behind parents who dropped off cars. But soon, word spread. Inside that garage, the janitor's daughter could explain gears and circuits better than most adults. Elena showed them how to measure torque using wrenches, how to imagine pressure using kettles, how to see numbers not as punishment but as patterns alive in the world. Joseph watched with quiet pride. His garage, once a place of solitary labor, had become something larger, a community classroom. The sign over the door was repainted, Washington and Alvarez Community Learning Annex. What had been dismissed as grease and noise became recognized by the district itself as a legitimate after-school space. Elena wore her oversized overalls like a uniform, sleeves rolled and face streaked with oil, her voice clear as she explained. She was still a child, but she carried herself like someone twice her age, her fire lighting the faces around her. At school, Henderson had changed too. Gone was the sharp dismissal, the iron certainty that only wealth bred brilliance. She began inviting her students to lead discussions, to bring in knowledge from their homes, their cultures, their imaginations. The classroom became a chorus, not a hierarchy. And at the heart of it all was Elena. Not as Henderson's favorite, not as a token, but as proof that the invisible wall between privilege and poverty could crack. One spring afternoon, Elena stood again before the board, this time not as a defendant, but as a symbol. Henderson had lobbied, against fierce opposition, to create a small scholarship fund named the Elena Alvarez Initiative. Its purpose was simple: to seek out hidden talent in Chicago's poorest neighborhoods, to test not pedigree but potential, to create pipelines where none had existed. Some board members grumbled, some parents fought. But Henderson, her voice steady now, stood unshaken. If my career ends here, let it end. But this child deserves more, and so do all the others we've ignored. The initiative passed, narrowly, bitterly, but it passed. On the first day of summer, Elena walked the campus of the University of Chicago not as a shadow trailing behind her father's cart, but as a student in the Engineering Summer Institute. She carried her notebook, its cover patched and worn, its pages brimming with sketches of gears, engines, and equations. Professors passed by without noticing her at first. She was too small, too young, too ordinary. But when she spoke, when she explained the logic of a gearbox, when she described pressure systems using the language of boiling kettles and teapots, they paused. They looked again. In their silence, Elena felt something shift. Recognition. That night, after her first day at the Institute, she walked past the university's Gothic towers, their spires cutting the sky like dark prayers. The bells tolled in the distance, echoing across the quad. She stopped beneath one tower, the cold stone rising above her, and placed her hand against it. Her father had walked these halls unseen. His broom had swept beneath these arches, his hands had polished these floors, but his mind had never been invited inside. Elena closed her eyes and whispered, "I will go far, but I will come back. And when I do, I'll open the doors for the others." The promise was no longer only for herself. It was for her father, for Rosa, for Joseph, for Mrs. Green, For every child who had ever been told, "You don't belong here." In the weeks that followed, Elena threw herself into study. She devoured books on mechanics and mathematics, her pencil filling every margin with sketches and questions. She listened to lectures on fluid dynamics, her mind racing ahead, imagining how turbulence, chaos, and flow might someday be harnessed. The word Navier-Stokes became to her not an impossibility, but a mountain waiting to be climbed. Yet even in the heart of her new world, she returned each evening to Hyde Park, to Joseph's garage. There, among oil-stained floors and battered cars, she taught the neighborhood children. She showed them what she learned, turning the Institute's lessons into simple metaphors, making the inaccessible accessible. The garage had become more than a workshop. It had become a seedbed. The story spread, first across Hyde Park, then throughout Chicago. Newspapers wrote of the janitor's daughter who rebuilt a gearbox. Local TV featured Henderson's class, now transformed into a model of collaboration. And the Elena Alvarez initiative began quietly identifying more children. A boy in Bronzeville who designed circuits out of scrap metal, a girl in Little Village who solved math puzzles with chalk on sidewalks. Elena was no longer alone. One evening, as the summer light faded, Elena sat outside the garage with Joseph and Rosa. The air smelled faintly of lilacs from a nearby yard. Cars rushed along 53rd Street, their headlights streaking gold across the pavement. Rosa reached over, placing her worn hand on Elena's.
You have carried us farther than I ever dreamed.
Joseph nodded, his deep voice steady. But remember, little engineer, the fight is not just yours. It belongs to all of us. You've opened the door. Now you must keep it open. Elena gazed up at the university towers in the distance, their windows glowing against the dark. She felt the weight of promise, but also its fire.
One day, they will see me,
she had once whispered. Now they had. And she, in turn, was determined that the world would see not just her, but all the children hidden in the shadows, waiting for someone to believe. Dear friends, if this story touched your heart, remember, Elena's journey is not just hers, but a mirror of every child the world overlooks. By listening, by sharing, we keep their fire alive. If you wish to walk with us through more stories of courage and hidden brilliance, please subscribe to this channel. Your presence here is more than a number. It is a promise that no child's light will ever be forgotten.